What's going on, voiceover warriors and keyboard ninjas? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Logic stock compressor. So the Logic stock compressor, not only is it a cool transparent digital compressor, but it has analog compression flavors built in based on classic vintage gear stuff you've probably heard of, like 1176 LA2As, the SSL compressor, Focusrite Red compressor, and the DBX160. And we'll take a listen to how some of those different flavors may affect your sound, as well as go over some of the basic controls of the compressor. Once again, thank you to Serene for letting me use her song. That way you guys get to hear some lovely singing. I'm going to interact with that main vocal track because the first thing I want to do before we look at the compressor is use the peak level meter at the end of the channel strip to kind of get an idea of where these vocals are peaking, because that's information that will come in handy when we start looking at the compressor. All right, so let's interact with this track.
In main vocals, track stack, off, solo, off, mute, 0.0 decibels, off, -6.4, peak, button.
And I'm going to clear this peak meter, so I just VO space on it to clear it. And I'm going to turn up VoiceOver a little bit, so I'm just going to do VO Shift Command, and I'll just use left and right arrows to make sure I'm on the volume.
Volume, 30%.
All right, it's on volume, so I'm going to do VO Shift Command up arrow.
30, 40%, 45, 50%, 55%, 60%, closing.
I just let go of VO Command Shift Space there. And that's a quick way that you can adjust some VoiceOver parameters on the fly. So I'm going to play this project, and we're going to use these meters to get a feeling for where the peak levels are on this voice. And this is a rather dynamic part of the vocals, which is why I picked it for this demo. And I already got my cycle range set up to just kind of cycle and play this one section of the project on repeat.
0 point off, -16.7, peak, button, 0.0 decibel, off, -8.4, peak, button, 0.0 decibel, off, -8.4, peak, button, 0.0 off, -4.8, peak, button.
And I don't know if you're able to hear that, but it started out at about -16 and it got up to about as loud as -4. So this is a very, very dynamic part of the vocal. She starts out singing really quietly. There's that one part in the middle there where she gets really loud and up there, and then it ends kind of quietly. And if I play this again, you'll hear some of these words are kind of getting lost in the mix a little bit. Now I'm going to add the compressor.
Main vocals, main vocals.
There we go. We got the compressor loaded up on the track. So much like the EQ,
Toolbar, button, bypass, checked, checkbox.
There's this bypass button, and once again, only in the plugin window. When bypass is checked, it means the plugin is active, and when bypass is unchecked, it means the plugin is bypassed.
Factory default, pop-up button.
This is where you can choose some presets, so you can just VO space on this, go down that list and find the presets. I'm sure there's a vocal category on here, a voice category on here as well, where you can choose some vocal presets.
Sidechain.
Sidechain, we'll cover this in a different tutorial, so we're going to skip over this for today.
Internal, pop-up, previous button.
Previous,
next button,
and next. These buttons let you go to the next or previous preset. Once again, you can just use the left and right brackets, so you don't have to keep coming over here to hit the next and previous buttons.
Compare, dimmed, unchecked, view, menu button.
The view menu, this once again, you may want to switch this to control view. However, there is the one aspect of this plugin where we're going to be in the editor view instead of controls view, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But for right now, we're going to start off in controls view. That's what I have all my plugins set to come up in by default, and that's what I definitely suggest you set yours to do as well. So I'm going to jump into the table here.
Unchecked, check table, compressor threshold, -20.0 decibel slider, 60% slider, selected.
So we got a couple of different parameters in here. The 4 parameters you need to pay attention to are going to be the threshold, the ratio, the attack, and the release time. This Logic compressor, because it's got a few different emulations of vintage voicings, you may want to choose the appropriate voicing as well to go with what you're working on. And then there's going to be an output gain as well. What that we'll look at. But your 4 main controls are going to be threshold, ratio, attack, and release. You get familiar with those 4 controls and you're pretty much good to go with any compressor out there. You understand the basics of how any compressor works. So let's interact with this table, because there's one thing I want to do before we start adjusting something that's very specific to the Logic stock compressor. So I'm going to interact with
In
this.
table, ratio, 2 point attack, 15, release, 50, gain, 0.0, knee, 0 points, peak slash RMS, auto gain, minus 12 decibels pop-up button.
All right, so this auto gain that's set to minus 12 dB. Auto gain is a feature that a lot of compressors have. And the nice thing about auto gain is it tries to keep the level of the audio coming out of the compressor about even with the level going in. So if you remember from the EQ tutorial, we're talking about level matching, trying to make sure that you got the levels about the same when the plugin's off versus on, so you can verify that you're making good decisions, because normally anything that sounds louder is going to sound better to our ears. A lot of compressors have what's called an auto gain option, and when you turn that on, the compressor will try to match the output level to the input level to help you make better decisions right away. Unfortunately, the way Logic does it is kind of interesting. They just have it to where you can turn auto gain off. You can have it auto gain to 0 dB, or you can have it auto gain to minus 12 dB. So I suggest just turning it off, because with it not being able to just match the input level, it might not be as useful. So I'm just gonna VO space on
Menu
this.
3 items check mark, minus 12 decibels.
You see set to minus 12.
0 decibel off.
I'm going to turn that
Auto gain,
off.
off pop-up button.
So now let's jump back to the top of this window and look at some of those basic controls.
Compressor threshold, minus 20.0 decibel slider, 60% slider.
All right, so the compressor threshold. The threshold is the level that the audio has to cross over before the compressor will kick in and react to that audio. So what exactly does a compressor do? Essentially what it does is it will get the quiet parts and the loud parts to be a little bit closer in volume to each other. So threshold means the level that the audio has to cross over for the compressor to kick in. And if you remember earlier, we were looking at the peak meter, and it says that this thing was starting out around minus 16 and the loudest point got up to minus 4. All right. And so right now this is set to minus 20. So that basically means that there's already compression happening if we turn this on right now, because the threshold is set to minus 20 and the loudest part of this audio was minus 16. So it's going over the threshold by about 4 dB basically. So if I play this, so you see that's already a little bit closer in level to where it was when we started, and we can get out of here
table.
And go to
main
the
vocals, toolbar, bypass, check,
bypass
checkbox.
button here.
Unchecked, bypass.
And I'm going to turn this on now.
Check, bypass, checkbox.
So you see that's already starting to sound a little bit more even.
Table. Compressor
and
threshold,
so I'm
minus
going to
20.0.
just jump back to the end where the table is. I'm going to interact with this.
Compressor threshold, minus 20.
And let's interact with the threshold.
Minus 20.0.
And let's turn this threshold down a little bit more. So the more we pull the threshold down, the more audio we're going to allow to be compressed.
Minus 25.0 decibels. Minus 30.0 decibels.
And if you see now, the whole thing's a little bit more leveled out. And I might not leave it on this setting, but I just wanted to set it to this setting just so you can kind of get a feeling for what the compressor can do. And I can go ahead and solo this for you.
Toggle channel strips.
You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation.
All right, so there you go. And can I bypass this here?
You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation.
You see right there when it's bypassed, it's definitely a lot more dynamic. There's a lot more loud parts, there's a lot more quieter parts.
You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly.
And right now it's a little bit more evened out. All right, so the next control we have, I'm going to stop interacting with the threshold
slider.
here.
Ratio 2.1:1 slider 21.
Next control we have is the ratio. And the ratio is basically how much compression is going to happen. So you can think of 2 to 1 as in every time the level crosses the threshold by 2 dB, it's going to be turned down by 1 dB. 4 to 1 ratio means every time it crosses by 4 dB, it's going to be turned down by 2 dB. And you can kind of do the math from there to figure out what some of the other settings are going to be. So you can think of the ratio as how much of the compression effect is going to happen. So the threshold determines how much of the signal gets let in and gets compressed. The ratio is how much compression is going to happen, how much of an effect is the compressor going to have on the signal. So right now it's on 2 to 1, I believe.
In rate
So
2.1:1 slider.
And let's go ahead and play this.
You said you're sorry.
3.1:1.
I left it hardly.
You see it's getting more compressed.
Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation. You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe
4.6:1. 6.8:1. 4.6:1.
You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation.
And there you have it. Sorry about that. I accidentally bumped it up twice there, but I left it on 4.6 to 1. 4.6:1 is how VoiceOver says it, but that's what I left it on. So I'm going to unsolo this so you can kind of hear this in the mix, and I'm going to go back down to 2.1 and 3.1 and come back up to 4.6 so you can kind of get a feeling for what these sound like.
Toggle channel strip solo off.
Three
3.1:1.
Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation.
2.1:1.
I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation.
3.1:1.
I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation.
4.6:1.
You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation.
And that kind of gives you an idea. And by the way, you can move these in small increments if you do VO shift left arrow. So
In slider.
VO shift left arrow.
4.4:1.
I left it hardly.
4.2:1.
It's not how you wanted to in this
4.1:1. 3.9:1. 4.1:1. 3.9:1.
And there you have it. So you can move those in small increments
Auto
with
slider.
VO shift left to right arrow. And you can also adjust the output gain if this is getting a little quiet. So I'm going to solo this here
Toggle
for a
channels.
second.
You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you.
Yes, I'm going to turn up the gain a little bit here.
Attack 15. Release. Gain 0.0 decibel slider. 30 in. 0.0 decibels in slider.
Maybe
0.1.0 dec 1.5 decibel 2.0 2.5 3.0 decibels.
let's
Auto
try
slider.
this. So this is,
You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly.
and let's bypass that.
You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly.
All right, that's about even. So let's re-engage that plugin.
You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly.
All right, so there we go. We got it level match.
Toggle channels.
You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe
All right, so now the next thing I like to do is go through the different circuit types, and the circuit types are the different emulations of compressors that I was talking about previously. So if I stop interacting with
Gain.
this
3.0 decibel slider. Out of table.
and just get out of this table,
Main vocals. Toolbar. Bypass. Check. Checkbox.
I'm going to go over to the view menu. So I just did VO home to jump to the top of this window, and I'm just going to VO right arrow.
Factory. Side chain. Internal. Previous. Next. Compare. View. Menu button.
View menu.
Menu. Check mark. Control. Editor.
Switch this over to
View.
editor.
Menu button. Link. Unchecked. Checkbox. Platinum digital button.
All right, so we start out on Platinum Digital. So this one's already selected. Unfortunately, these don't speak, but the thing is, if we use the pop-up button in the main window, we get thrown to the top of the interface every time we change the type. So I just prefer to do these from here, even though they don't speak. You just got to try and keep track of which ones you have selected, since it doesn't say which one's selected. So right now, Platinum Digital is the one that's selected because that's what it comes up on by default. So I'm going to play these and then go through and show you what some of these different options sound like.
Studio Ka button.
So Studio Ka,
Studio Fat button.
Studio Fat,
Classic Ka button.
Classic Ka, which is a VCA, Classic VCA,
Vintage Ka button.
Vintage Ka, which is Vintage VCA,
Vintage Fat button.
Vintage Fat, and the fat ones are 1176, two different flavors of 1176s.
Vintage Octo button.
And Vintage Octo, which is an LA2A. And the vintage and the VCAs are a SSL, a DBX, and a Focusrite Red. I'll put a list up on the logic.band site to tell you more about what each of these are. So check the link in the description for that. All right, so we got those different circuit types. So I'm going to go back up to Platinum Digital.
Studio Ka Platinum Digital button. Studio Ka button.
And I'm going to play this starting out on the Platinum Digital and then switch over to the Studio VCA.
You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation.
VCA, Studio.
You're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation.
I'll start on the Studio VCA and I'll switch to the Studio Fat.
Studio Fat button.
You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation. You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation.
Classic Ka button.
So now we're going to start on the Studio Fat and switch to the Classic VCA.
You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation. You said you're sorry, and I
Vintage Ka button.
We're going to start out on the Classic VCA and then switch to the Vintage VCA.
You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation. You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's
Vintage Fat button.
We're going to start out on the Vintage VCA and then switch to the Vintage Fat.
you said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation. You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you
Let's
Vintage Octo
go over
button.
here to the Vintage Octo.
You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation. You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation.
And you can go back through and try out a couple of these just to figure out which one you want. That gives you an idea of what the different tones are like. The FETs definitely have a different tone from the VCAs, and the VCAs, while subtler of a difference, there's still a difference between the different VCAs. And while you're relatively new to this stuff, feel free to solo these and just kind of go through and kind of get your ears kind of dialed into what the differences are between some of these. But remember, don't rely on solo to make your final decisions. You definitely want to unsolo it, listen to it in the mix, and see how it kind of fits in the mix. And remember to always kind of level match as well, because sometimes some of these will be a little bit louder. So once you make a final decision on which one of these circuits you want to use, level match with the dry signal and just make sure that's the one you want to go with. And I don't think you need to sit there and level match in between selecting each of these, but you definitely want to level match with the dry signal once you make a final decision. All right, so I'm going to go back to controls view. So I'm just going to view left arrow out of here.
Vintage, classic, studio, platinum, link, uncheck, view, menu button.
There's the view menu, view space
menu,
on
10
this.
controls.
Go to controls.
View, menu button.
All right.
Link, uncheck, table. Compressor
And
threshold.
now we're back to controls view.
In table, ratio, 3.9:1 slider. Attack, 15.0 milliseconds
And now
slider.
the attack and release time. So attack basically has to do with how quickly the compressor reacts once something crosses the threshold. So remember, crossing the threshold means that's when the compressor kicks in and it reacts to your signal. The ratio is how much the compressor is going to affect the signal. Now the attack is how quickly the compressor affects the signal. So 50 milliseconds, that means it takes 50 milliseconds to go from no compression to the 3.9 to 1 compression ratio that we have set. And if we set this to a higher number, it means it'll take a little bit longer. If we set it to a low number, it means the compressor kicks in right away. The nice thing about a compressor is it can make it sound like the singer is putting a little bit more emphasis and oomph on what they're saying. It can make it sound like you're hitting that drum a little bit harder if you dial in this attack time right and this release time right. If you dial in this attack time right. So that's kind of one of the advantages of a compressor. Sure, you can ride the volume and level out your vocal that way, but then you don't get that characteristic that the compressor can bring to your sound of just making it sound like that singer is putting just that more effort into it. So I'm going to solo this one just to give you an idea what this can do.
In attack, 15.0 milliseconds.
So I'm going to hit play and then turn this up a little bit.
You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation.
20.0
You
milliseconds.
said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation. You said you're sorry.
50.0 milliseconds.
I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation.
That's at 50, and you see more of the starting of the words are not being clamped down on, and you'll notice that more as I bring this back down towards lower values.
You said you're sorry.
20.0 milliseconds.
I left it hardly.
15.0 milliseconds.
Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation. You said you're
10.0 milliseconds.
sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not
5.0
how
milliseconds.
you wanted to in this situation. You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation.
So you see, as we bring it down, that's a little bit more evened out, as opposed to when you bring it up, you start to hear the compressor doesn't kick in until just after the words are started. So I'm going to take this from 5 up to 50 just so you can kind of hear the difference. So this is 5.
You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation.
And
10.0, 15.0, 20.0, 50.0 milliseconds.
this is 50.
You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation. You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation.
And for comparison, 5.
10.0 milliseconds. 5.0 milliseconds.
You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to
All right. And so now we're going to jump over
Auto
to
slider.
the release.
Release 51.0.
And the release is the opposite of the attack. The attack is how quickly it takes for the signal to get fully compressed. The release is how quickly it takes before the compressor lets go of the signal when the signal drops back below the threshold. So right now I think we had our threshold set to minus 30 dB. So when the signal drops back below minus 30 dB, how long does it take for the compressor to stop compressing? So interact with this.
51.0.
You see this is on 51 milliseconds. And once again, I'm going to
Slider.
solo this and take you up a little bit and take you down just so you can kind of hear what that sounds like.
You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly.
91.0 milliseconds.
Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation. You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation. You said you're
51.0
sorry,
milliseconds.
and I left it hardly.
29.0
Maybe
milliseconds.
it's not how you wanted to in this situation. You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not
16.0
how
milliseconds.
you wanted to in this situation. You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly.
And what you notice in here is that as you bring this release time down, you hear, and it's not sustained, it's not holding out the quiet parts as much. So it becomes you instead of you, because it's letting go of those quiet parts a lot quicker. I'm going to play that again.
You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly.
That's 16. Let's go back up to
29.0.
51.
51.
You said you're sorry.
And then if we take this up a little
91.
more.
160.
You said you're sorry, and I.
So now it's you said you're sorry instead of you said you're sorry. So that's kind of how you can think about what it's doing. It's letting go the ends of those things a lot sooner, so to speak. All right. So once again, you want to put this in the mix to make your final decision.
Toggle channel strip solo
So
off.
let's hear what this sounds like with the music.
You said you're sorry.
91.0 milliseconds.
I left it hardly.
51.0 milliseconds.
Maybe it's not how
29.0
you
milliseconds.
wanted to in this situation. You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation.
16.0
You're
milliseconds.
sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation. You said you're
29.0 mil.
sorry,
51.0 milliseconds.
I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation. You said you're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation.
91.0 milliseconds.
You're sorry, and I left it hardly. Maybe it's not how you wanted to in this situation.
And there you go. And those decisions you make are probably going to be different, whether it's a slow song or it's a much faster song, whether these are vocals, drums, etc., etc., etc. But that's the basic features that will help you get started with any compressor, whether it be the Logic stock compressor or any compressor that has a standard set of compression controls. The cool thing about this Logic compressor is it's got some saturation built in. There's a limiter built in case you just want to put something at the end to catch some peaks, and there's some side chaining facilities built in, whether if you use an internal side chain, so you can kind of use it as a de-esser. A lot more to cover here, but that is the basic controls you need to be familiar with to use any compressor. So that's it for this one. Hope you learned a lot about using compressors and compression and the cool features in the Logic compressor. As I said, there's a lot more to cover, so please feel free to reach out if you want to take in-depth training. I do some one-on-one training. Drop me a message. Visit logic.band/training, link in the description below. Anyway, until next time, like, share, and subscribe. And everyone, remember, happy recording.